Okay, so this is going to be your lecture on They Say, I Say, summarizing and quoting. So this is going to review things from chapter 2, but also focus on chapters 3, 4, and 5 that all have to do with quoting and responding to quotes. So I'm going to briefly go back and review chapter 2, which is about summarizing. So just remember, when you summarize a source, you want to emphasize ideas that interest you, and also concepts that relate directly to your own essay's central claims. So a summary, again, is just a general overview of what you read, but you also, rather than just regurgitating information, want to make sure that information that you summarize really has a lot to do with what you want to be talking about within your essay. Don't forget to read carefully and make sure you understand what your source is saying. Too often I see students summarizing and quoting sources, and their interpretation of what the source is saying is wrong. So don't use a source if you're not 100% sure that you understand what it's saying, because if you do that, then your essay is going to get mixed up and it's going to be confusing to your readers. Along those same lines, don't put words in your source's mouth. What that means is, when you summarize, make sure you're summarizing what your source is actually saying and not jumping to conclusions about what your source means. So don't put in ideas that are not actually in that source. Okay, so getting into quoting. This is something that I see students do a lot. Don't assume a quote speaks for itself. You always have to talk about the quote. Don't throw a quote into your paper and then just move on. Just like I want you to do with summaries, every time you quote, remember you're quoting what they say. You want to follow up with talking about what you have to say. How does this quote fit into your paper? How does it relate to the points you're bringing up or the argument you're trying to make? Don't stick in random quotes. This is another mistake that I see students do. They're like, okay, I need some quotes. I'm just going to pick out a couple random sentences, throw it into my paper, quote is done. Well, your quotes have to do something. Quoting is not about throwing some sentences in from other sources. Quoting is about using what other sources have had to say to build your own essay around. So you want to show that you've done the research and you know what other people have to say about your topic, but then you want to build on that. You want to have some kind of response. How does what these other sources have said about your topic relate to what you have to say about it? Signal phrases. So these can be found on pages 39 through 40, but this is just to help you, rather than just saying he says this, she says that, you can use a little bit more interesting verbs when you are kind of summarizing and quoting what your sources are saying. And so you need to be making use of these. Don't just rely on one signal phrase over and over and over. That starts to sound really boring and monotonous. So make use of some of these other signal phrases. Use them correctly. So for example, don't say someone is complaining if they're not really complaining. Use them correctly, but get a little bit more creative in those introductions when you're saying so-and-so, and then you'll have your signal phrase. So rather than so-and-so says, so-and-so asserts, or denies, or demands, because that can just make your essay more interesting. Okay, so this is the number one mistake that students make when it comes to quoting, is starting a sentence with a quote. And so you don't want to do this. There's no introduction here. Even though it says the author's name here, it's not being linked to the quote. We want to link the author to the quote, and other things we want are, who is this author? Why should I care who this person is? You want to give me the credentials of this person. Why should I care what they have to say about this topic? you need a signal phrase to link this this first sentence to the quote itself, so we understand that this is the person who's actually making this statement. And then finally, we need to talk about it. So in this example, it's got the quote, and then the person says, I think this author is right. Here's another point that's made. Rather than explaining, why? Why do you think this author is right? Do you even really understand what this author is saying? So there's no explanation of what the writer is getting out of this quote, or why the writer of this particular not Susan Bordeaux, but the writer who's writing this part. Why do you think this person is right? What do you make of these statistics and of what Susan Bordeaux is trying to say? So you've got to be a little bit more thorough when you respond to your quotes. Another thing I see students do is not even include this, I think this person is right. They have their quote and then they just move on. Don't do that. That's bad. I need to know that you understand this quote and that you have some reason for using it, that it's building to something in your paper, that you're using it for a reason rather than just saying, here's some sentences from my source, let me slap them into my essay. Because that's not what quotes are used for. So always remember the quote sandwich. So the first piece of bread is the person you're quoting, their credentials, and a signal phrase. Now you don't have to do this over and over, so the first time you use a source, you should definitely introduce who they are by giving their credentials. But if you use that person again, then you can just say their last name and the signal phrase. And that will be sufficient for the first piece of bread. The meat, or the peanut butter and jelly, is the quote itself with page numbers if needed. So if you're using databases, that's fine, no page numbers required. But if you're using a print source, an actual book or magazine, then you'll need those page numbers in there. And then finally, the last piece of bread, the one that people are the worst at, some kind of explanation of the quote or response to the quote. So let's look at some possibilities for those first and last pieces of bread. And so this is what They Say, I Say is all about, is giving you these templates, helping you integrate your quotes into your essays. So for that first piece of bread, you can say things like, X, a prominent scholar of blank, states his opinion of the issue. And so this is, here's the person's name, here is their credentials, here's the introduction that leads into the quote, and then you would give your quote itself. And there's a lot of examples of these. I'm not going to go over every single one, but this is what They Say, I Say is all about, is giving you those templates so you don't have to come up with what to say on your own. You just have to plug in the information, put the author's name here, and tell us, what is this person an expert at? The last piece of bread. Now this one, there's a lot of ways to do this. And They Say, I Say has a bunch of different templates. You can do something like this, which is explaining the quotation, meaning you give the quotation and then you tell us in your own words, what do you think this means? What is this person trying to say in this quote that you're giving us? Other ways to respond are to talk about why you agree or why you disagree, or you can agree and disagree. That's perfectly fine as well. But you need to have something after this quote that shows us that you understand what the author is saying, and often give us some kind of response that lets us know, how do you feel about what your source is saying? And so if you look at these pages, that I think it's chapter 4 that really gets into the different ways to respond. Yeah, chapter 4, yes, no, okay, but, that talks about all the different ways that you can respond to a quote. That's a really good chapter. Those templates are going to be really helpful to you as you're finishing this paper. So here's one other thing that I want to say about when you're quoting, something that you need to remember to do, actually quoting and summarizing. So Here's an example. These are called voice markers, these things that I've underlined. But let's look at how this section works with the voice markers, and then we'll look at it without it. So the article "Children Should Be Tried as Adults" by June Velez explains why the author believes teenagers who commit murder are mature and intelligent enough to be tried as adults. Velez argues that these teens know right from wrong. So this is giving a summary about this particular source. Now these underlined things are really, really important, and you need to be using them in your paper. Why? Because here's what happens if you don't use these voice markers. The article "Children Should Be Tried as Adults" explains why teenagers who commit murder are mature and intelligent enough to be tried as adults. These teens know right from wrong. So in the first one, when we use these voice markers, it's obvious that these are the opinions of June Velez, the author of this article. In this second part, when we take those voice markers out, whose opinion does it sound like? It sounds like yours, the writer. Now, regardless of whether you agree with this or not, when you're summarizing from a source, you want to make it clear that this is what your source has to say. These are not things that you are saying. This is your source's opinions. So that's why we need those voice markers. That's why you want to go back and refer to the source, the author's name, or if there's not an author's name, the name of the article, to let us know here's what they have to say. And then that'll make it clear when it's you talking. So going back to our example, the Susan Bordeaux example, something I want to point out is that it's always better to over-explain a quote than under-explain it. So let's look at a better example. We've already looked at the bad example. Here's the good example. The feminist philosopher Susan Bordeaux is disturbed by the increasing numbers of women across the globe who are dieting due to pressure from the media. So this is our summary of the Susan Bordeaux article. And then this stuff that's in bold, this is basically using a template from They Say, I Say. So this is explaining the credentials, giving the author's name, and using one of those action words to lead into our summary. Then we have our introduction to the quote. She explains how Fiji is a prime example of this trend. So we've got, she explains how, so we're showing what this particular quote is doing. It's an explanation. After the quote itself, we've got a page number because this comes from a print source. And then we've got our response. Bordeaux's point is that the Western world's obsession with dieting is spreading to even the most remote areas. So, again, we've introduced our source. We've given a summary of what she has to say in her particular article. We've introduced this quote, given the page number, and then we've got a response that shows that we understand what the source is saying. You could even go further, one step further, and explain, do you agree with what Bordeaux is saying or not? So I want you to come back to this example as you do your writing assignment. So first I'll go through, I'll explain the writing assignment, but you're probably going to want to come back and use this particular paragraph as a model to help you with our writing assignment. So here's the writing assignment. Do this in steps. So step 1, read Don't Blame the Eater, which is just a really short essay. It's like 3 pages in They Say, I Say, pages 195 through 197. So first you'll read that. Then you're going to use that as your example to do these next couple of steps. So in 1 or 2 sentences, you're going to write a summary of this essay, Don't Blame the Eater. Now, in order to do that, you're going to have to read it carefully and make sure you understand what the author is saying, because there are a couple of places where this author gets complex and it might sound like he's on one particular side of the argument when he's actually on the other side. So read it carefully from beginning to end and make sure you understand it before you start trying to answer these questions. So you'll write a summary of the essay and you'll use one of the verbs on page 39 through 40 to introduce it. So again, going back to our example, we use this disturbed. But you can use any of those that are on those pages. You can use, this person is arguing, complaining, advocating, warning, but tell us what that author's doing. Give us the author's name, give us his credentials if you can find that. I think there's a short biography in there. And then you can summarize it after using one of those action signal phrases to introduce the summary. So that's what you're going to do for step 2. Then for step 3, you're going to pick a quote. So pick a good quote, a relevant quote. So don't just pick a random sentence from this essay. Pick one that you feel like is doing something in the essay, and one that you can give a good response to. So any quote, but again, make sure it's a good one. And then you're going to do that quote sandwich. So for step 3, you're going to start by picking a quote, introducing it, using one of the templates on page 46 in They Say, I Say. And if you want to tweak these, that's fine. You don't have to use them word for word. They're in there to kind of show you and be examples of models that you can use. But you can change the language a little bit to make it better fit what you have to say. But use a template or something similar to one of those templates on page 46 to introduce your quote, and then have the quote itself. Don't forget the page numbers because this is a print source. Then for step 4, you're going to give some kind of response. So this is the last piece of bread. You're going to explain or respond to the quote. You need to talk about why you picked this quote, how it fits into the overall essay, or just showing us why you think that quote's important, why you agree or disagree with it. There's a lot of different ways that you could explain or respond to it. There's a lot of different templates in They Say, I Say that you could use after the quote. And again, if you want to change the templates up a little bit, tweak the words, that's perfectly fine. But look at those templates, pick one that you like, and either use it exactly as it is or tweak it a little bit and make it fit what you want to say about this quote that you've picked. And here's where I want to just briefly bring up something that They Say, I Say says that's really, really good. Do not call these quotes quotes. Here's why. And when I say that, I mean you would not say David Zinczenko quotes. Why would you, or a quote by David Zinczenko? Why can you not call it a quote? Because that gets confusing. You, the writer, are the one quoting, but your source is not quoting. Your source is just talking. So don't call a quote, because that makes it confusing. That makes it sound like your source is using someone else's words when they aren't. You are the one doing the quoting, but your source is not quoting. So that's why you never want to say, in a quote by so-and-so, because that's technically incorrect. All right, so going back to your steps, after you've completed steps 2 through 4, go back and read them together. You want to read them back to back and make sure they all flow together so that you could put them into one single paragraph and they would fit together cohesively, like our Susan Bordeaux example. So let's go back to that really quickly to show you what I mean. You don't have to do it in this paragraph format when you are completing steps 2 through 4. You can write step 2 and answer it, and then step 3 and answer it. That's perfectly fine. However, when you read it, it should all flow together. So it should sound like it could be put together in this paragraph and it would make sense. Because I want you to get used to doing this with your sources. Get used to giving us summaries and quotes and responses to quotes every time you use a source and having it all flow together. So that's what I mean with step 5. You don't actually have to do anything if you read steps 2 through 4 and they all fit together. If they don't fit together, you want to go back, and again, I love the word tweak. Tweak things, tweak your words, tweak your introductions and your responses to make sure that you could put that all into one paragraph and have it flow nicely from beginning to end. And like I said, again, go back, look at that Susan Bordeaux example, and use that as a model to help you as you're writing this, to make sure you're doing what I've asked you to do. Alright, so if you have any questions, you can email me. Otherwise, this will be due in class the next time I see you.